When you die, you wake up. Into what? More of your own consciousness. You'll experience another layer of the onion that is yourself. Surely you've heard Einstein's quote, "Imagination is everything." That's a literal statement. This is what he and other people who think and speak similarly are trying to communicate, this principle of oneness right here. All is mental. All is God. This is what these people have been trying to communicate for thousands of years. These layers look different depending on the worldview lens that you're viewing them through. Your beliefs about what happens after death will shape your experience after death. People from a Christian background have a funny way of seeing Jesus or God in these experiences. Hindu practitioners have a funny way of seeing whichever deity they've been praying to or meditating on. Those who think of things more in terms of energy and vibration of a unified field will have experiences based on that perspective. Now, that's not to say that if someone is a scientifically minded atheist who believes it's lights out when they die, that they'll actually experience that. I was one of those people, and when I experienced death and noticed that I was still conscious afterward, everything immediately made more sense. It happened almost instantaneously, just like waking up from a dream and realizing it was a dream. It became obvious that I'm not only limited to experiencing that particular dream reality as real, but so much more. Let me do my best to explain how you perpetually create reality for yourself. Surely you've heard this idea before, and you're probably not satisfied with the explanations you've heard because this kind of thing leads to paradox and can't be fully explained using words. But it's fun to try. These thought exercises have a way of triggering a spontaneous connecting of the dots in a very small percentage of people who are ready for such an awakening. The fundamental mechanism that's driving your experience right now is you explaining to yourself how your existence is possible. That's what forms human belief systems. Your explanation for how it's possible for you to be right where you are right now is your belief system. Everyone has one. They're formed automatically by the ego mind and for the most part are required for you to exist here. How did you get here? Tell me. Do you believe there was a ball of hot magma that congealed into a planet? Then somehow life sprung forth from non-living, non-conscious matter, and consciousness somehow came into existence after physical matter? Then your parents evolved from lower life forms, got freaky-deaky with each other, and 9 months later, you popped out your mom's vajayjay? Is that what you think happened? Is that your explanation for how your existence is possible? If so, that's your belief system. You're God. You're the one thing that has always been. Any explanation you come up with for how you came into existence is not going to be the truth, because you've always existed. Do you get it? You can get it intellectually, which is the lowest form of understanding, but you really need to experience it to understand it deeply or to even believe it. The question people will eventually be trying to answer is, how can an infinite, eternal consciousness create finite experiences for itself, using the only thing it has: mind, consciousness, imagination, energy, or whatever we're calling it? Obviously, you've been disconnected from your memory and previous experience. To even use the word previous demonstrates the limitations of our language, perspective, and understanding, since the dimension of time is created by consciousness as part of the experience, just as the other dimensions are created. Your unconscious mind disconnects you from memories of previous experience because it's required for you to have new experiences like the one you're having right now. It's hard to experience novelty when you're omniscient. You have to disconnect yourself from the memory, all of your memory, and your identity as God in order to experience something new, exciting, or surprising. In most cases, this is required for you to be here, adopt an ego identity, and experience your creation from the inside as it's unfolding. God, or source energy, universal consciousness, whatever we're calling it, does not have a finite fixed perspective. It has to create one within itself, which is where you and your ego came from. You are God's creation, the son or daughter of God, and yes, I'm going to say it, you are Jesus himself. Everyone is. If you're familiar with the Bible, that's a symbolic text that people have been reading. It's been watered down for the masses, and its original message is very hard to find, and that's assuming you know what to look for. You'll know what to look for when you realize that you're the one who wrote it. You created the Bible and everything else in existence. You are becoming and ever evolving. You now have different ways of talking about and explaining these things that might make more sense to you now, but that old book that you wrote is still around. You ever wonder why so many people have mystical experiences and end up thinking that they're God or Jesus? I mean, you ever wonder? It's because they are. You are Jesus or Muhammad, or pick your favorite prophet. You are the physical manifestation of God, the son or daughter of God, who is also God at the same time. Everyone is. Have you ever spent time trying to understand these paradoxes? If it seems contradictory and paradoxical to say that you created yourself and that you're both the creator and the created, well, yes, it certainly is paradoxical, which, as I've already explained, is a fundamental feature of reality. Reality is infinite, it contains paradoxes and contradictions, and you're one of them. Your conscious mind is what you think it is. Your unconscious mind is everything you think you're not. Ego is your finite conscious mind, the manifestation of God in human form, otherwise known as Jesus, Muhammad, or another prophet of your choosing from a symbolic text. If you believe there was only one prophet, this is the product of indoctrination. It's how religions keep their followers and grow their influence and power, which they believe to be the best thing for the world at large. Everything that you think you aren't, like the world around you, is your unconscious mind, or the mind of God that you're in, however you want to think about it. God, or your unconscious mind, which you previously had access to before you were born here, is what created your finite ego mind within itself. Yes, Jesus died for your sins. That was you. You've already sinned, died, and forgot about it more than once. It's not what the Bible says, though, is it? Here's why I think that the Bible and many religious texts have been watered down and the original message has been lost. When we read the Bible, obviously we're reading a version of it that has been transcribed, translated, and originally copied by hand multiple times. If anyone in this chain of passing it on, which is similar to the old children's game telephone, if anyone passing it on makes a mistake or deliberate alteration, the mistake is perpetuated. Would anyone in history, perhaps a king or someone who has absolute power and covets even more power and control, do you think someone like that might change the narrative to suit their agenda? Isn't this exactly the kind of shit that people do all the time? In fact, aren't people still doing this shit today? Do you think this is something new? A person manipulating the media to further their agenda? Something only afforded by modern technology? I got news for you. Reading, writing, and the printing press were modern technology at one point in time, a tool of leverage used to spread your message and influence around the world. But let's pretend this didn't happen. And in a moment I'll explain how it's possible for significant changes in the meaning of the text to happen unintentionally, without intent to control or subjugate humanity. And I'm not just talking about the Bible here, I'm talking about any authoritative text or information source that influences human thought. This includes religious texts, as well as science, which has manipulated plenty of information to suit the agenda of whoever is paying for it, and of course, just the media in general. Those who seek to control the population do so by controlling the information sources that the population looks to for truth. Before religion and God, before, I should say, it was religion and God was where people looked to for truth. Now science is the new belief system of the day, and that's where people look to for truth. They no longer look inside for the truth and follow their heart or their intuition. They now look outside of themselves and think it's wise to exclusively follow the evidence, which is very easy to manipulate, or they follow what other authoritative people say is the truth. So science is the new information source that must be controlled and manipulated to suit the agenda. For those of you still in the dark, I'll give you an example. pharmaceutical companies arranged our legal system in such a way that it's legal for them to pay millions of dollars worth of incentives to medical journals and even individual researchers that publish studies supporting pharmaceutical drugs. A drug may have 20 inconclusive studies and 3 demonstrating efficacy, an ability to beat placebo, which happens all the time. For those who don't know much about medical research, even placebos can beat other placebos if you try enough times. Seriously. The power of the mind to influence the body's health is terribly underrated in Western medicine. Anyways, if the medical journal publishes the inconclusive studies, not many people reading will give a shit, and the editors don't get paid millions in bonuses. If they publish the 3 that demonstrate something new, now that gets attention, and millions of dollars worth of pharmaceutical incentives, legally paid to the editors of these peer-reviewed journals. So guess which studies get published, and guess which ones get ignored. Now, when an evidence-based medicine doctor comes along and looks at the peer-reviewed evidence, the highest standard, all 3 studies demonstrate safety and efficacy. All 3 peer-reviewed studies that have been published in reputable journals will demonstrate safety and efficacy. So what's the doctor's conclusion going to be based on the information that was screened and filtered and presented to him? He's going to think it's a great drug. Let's push it. You see how that works? That's one simple and easily verifiable example of how controlling the flow of information can help the controller rise in wealth, power, and influence. There's no shortage of people willing to lie to us for money, power, and influence. These are the people who want power and control the most. They're the hungriest for it, willing to do anything for it. So they usually get it. They get it by controlling and manipulating the sources of information that people look to for truth. Any sort of centralized power or information source is a magnet for criminals. Anyways, let me get back to this holy text example. Way back in the day, it was monks and scribes making hand copies of the Bible, and only a few people had copies, mainly the wealthy, powerful people in big churches. They were often the only ones who could read, after all. Once the Bible started being translated, now we're bringing translators into the picture. If the Bible was written as a somewhat accurate symbolic representation of reality, it would need to contain paradoxes and things that don't make logical sense. I assure you, the true nature of reality is not logical or rational. We can explain logical things with words and symbols. We can't do that with reality because it contains paradoxes and contradictions. For example, the notion of you creating yourself sounds paradoxical as shit, doesn't it? Where did that guy come from? Oh, he created himself. Ah, that doesn't make any fucking sense at all. But that's what happens when God creates a human form for himself to experience the wonder and mystical nature of not being God. Something new, something different. Yes, God can create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it. And God can create a dream so real that he himself doesn't realize it's a dream. Shit gets old when you already have and know everything. What do you do in that situation? You disconnect yourself from that knowledge and experience by becoming a finite being. Now you've got something new and exciting going on. It's like playing a video game you designed and forgot about. So now here you are, struggling with parts of it and enjoying parts of it as a new experience where you don't already know what's going to happen. Here's the point I'm getting at right here. If any of these scribes making hand copies of the book or any of these translators doing the translating didn't actually understand it deeply, and they came across something paradoxical that didn't make sense according to their worldview, they could very easily and inadvertently change the wording and change the entire meaning of the communication. This applies to translators as well. It is very common for someone who has experienced the true nature of reality to write something in an attempt to try communicating this understanding with words, which, as you may already know, can't be done. It's then very common for someone else to come along, read those words, and then mistakenly believe they understand what was meant by them. This was me in my teenage years reading religious, spiritual, and philosophical books. Oh, yeah, I totally get it. Totally. Yeah, I understand exactly what the author is trying to say here. But you can't get it if you don't have the direct experience of it. Most people don't even have enough life experience to realize that this is not the kind of thing you can get by having someone tell you about it. It's like trying to explain what colors are to a blind person. They don't have the prerequisite experience to understand what's being said. This is what's happening in most organized religions around the world that have a holy book. Not only do the followers not get it, because it's very easy to think you've got it, but it can't actually be explained to you with words. Many of the experts, the priests, the monks, the biblical scholars, are making the same mistake in a larger, much more complex way. They're convinced they get it because they've spent lots of time reading about it and talked about it with other experts. But they've never experienced the true nature of reality, so they can't possibly get it. But they'll feel like they do. They'll be convinced that they do. And their conviction will spread when they share their ideas with other people. Let's get back to people changing words and meanings in an attempt to help. Take the very first words of the Bible. In the beginning. What does this sound like so far? Remember what I just said about belief systems and the fact that you're eternal and do not have a beginning? This already sounds a lot like someone writing an explanation for how their existence is possible. There is no beginning. I mean, you can pick a beginning anywhere, a beginning of this or that or whatever it is, but ultimately there's no beginning. In fact, what we're doing here with, in the beginning is we're starting to paint a picture of linear time. How different would this text feel and read if we changed the word the to a? So it read, in a beginning. How different of a picture would we be painting by changing this one word? Now, it sounds like there might be more than one beginning, and we're alluding to the cyclical nature of reality. Now we're actually acknowledging eternity, which has no beginning or end. Abrahamic religions have a funny way of painting existence as something that happens on a linear timeline. This only makes sense if you're looking at it from a human perspective. Make one mistake at any given point in time in your existence and you go to hell forever? You think a benevolent God would have rules like that for his children? Come on. You can go to hell all right until your intent and your will pulls you out and you go back around for another lap in our cyclical existence. When you die and gain a greater perspective, you'll see the dance that your awareness does back and forth between being here and being on the other side of here. This point of whether the original word was the or a is an actual point debated by scholars and people who study comparative religion. Many people believe it was a translation or transcription error. This is just one example of the many transcription or translation errors that are possible. This book was originally written in a very old language that no one living today is entirely familiar with. All we're doing is making best guesses as to what the symbolic meaning is after a number of words have been inadvertently changed by people trying to help who perhaps didn't understand it's supposed to sound funny. It's supposed to sound paradoxical and contradictory. It's supposed to challenge your belief system, which has been neatly ordered with words that can't possibly paint the picture. Can you see how people might be trying to help by fixing perceived errors that they found? Can you see how their error recognition system might be erroneous? Can you see how those fixes can change the original meaning of the text? If I had to pick a shape for eternity, I'd say it's a circle. It just keeps going round and round. It's cyclical. It's not a perfect circle, retracing its steps and having history repeat itself exactly. No, that's way too oversimplified. It's a habituation. It's a default pattern for reality to do that. But the will and intent of consciousness evolving doesn't allow it to repeat exactly. When you see the whole thing at once, it's obvious. But if you're only looking from a human perspective, well, now you're just looking at one little line segment of the circle, and time can appear as linear. But from a larger perspective, it's a circle, or a cycle that keeps repeating, very much like a frequency or vibration. You can also think of it as an oscillation back and forth from the top of the circle to the bottom of the circle, and the tops and bottoms are relative to perspective. We can make the cyclical nature of reality look like ones and zeros if we really wanted to. The roots of mathematics become obvious when you're able to shift your perspective and think about the universe in terms of frequency and vibration, as Nikola Tesla's famous quote goes. I know that some of you might think these scribes and translators are experts who understand the material thoroughly because they've been studying it their whole life. But again, the true nature of reality cannot be communicated with words and symbols. It's something that can only be gained by experiencing it directly for yourself. If you read about it, or if someone told you about it, that's not it, because it can't be communicated. If you think you can just explain reality to someone else and they'll get it, this is definitely not it. It can only happen through your own spontaneous connecting of the dots, your own glimpse of the whole all at once. Just because someone spends much of their time reading religious texts doesn't mean they're going to understand what's meant by them. Even if these people devoted their lives to this, very few of these people understood the message that was written, and that's only because they've already experienced it. Most don't get the message because they have no memory of their union with or existence as God. It's extremely odd to get the message and still take part in organized religion. Once you have mental programming installed at a young age, it's terribly difficult to transcend your upbringing and awaken. Once someone is convinced at a very young age that there is no way they could possibly be God themselves, and there's no way they could possibly be creating this experience for themselves on the fly as it's happening, because it's already been created on a linear timeline that they're locked into. Once someone is convinced of this, and they're surrounded by people who believe the same thing, it becomes their belief system. It's very hard to transcend your belief system and your own dogma because you can't see it, because it looks like obvious truth to you. It's important you understand this. Dogma looks like obvious truth to the person who is experiencing it. It only looks like dogma to an outside observer with a different belief system. And if it's not obvious, I don't expect to actually communicate the true nature of reality to you right now using words. I can only talk about it in an attempt to trigger a spontaneous connecting of the dots within you. So let's get back to what happens after you die. If you leave your original form here for good, we call this death. If you leave and come back in the same form, we call this a near-death experience, or an out-of-body experience. People have different names and labels. Though I think that death experience is a more accurate way of describing it. Your death or near-death experience can be damn near anything. It's just one of the many infinite experiences that your mind is able to create for you. And it does it by using as much of your pre-existing belief system as it can, since your beliefs are the bubblegum that's holding this whole thing together. God at its core doesn't have any beliefs or limitations. The only belief might be that anything is possible within the infinite imagination of God. If you didn't have your bubblegum beliefs holding your worldview together, you'd be one step closer to God consciousness. Your beliefs are what form the walls and the ceilings in your figurative reality, as well as your actual physical reality. Part of what defines God is having infinite perspectives, or infinite eyeballs, let's say. God is connected to all of the eyeballs in the world, make that the universe, at the same time. Perhaps you've experienced this on a psychedelic trip. You and your ego perspective right now are the finite eyeball. You're the eyeball that can see everything but itself. Also, as an eyeball, you can't see what you're connected to on the inside. You can't see where your life force comes from. You can only feel it. You can't see where the information you're gathering is going. It just goes beyond into your unconscious and gets used or stored there. As one of the universe's eyeballs, you are no longer the infinite God perceiving all of the eyeballs. You're now just a finite eyeball, which is way different than having billions of eyeballs scattered about. You can see some of the other eyeballs from the outside, but you can no longer see what they're seeing from the inside. You can only see the perspective of your own eyeballs from the inside. The very nature of having a perspective requires finiteness. Some of you have no problem acknowledging there's no such thing as other in your dreams. You recognize that all you are perceiving is yourself. You recognize that everything is taking place in a mental world of your own creation. What's different in waking life? Is it because you don't remember ever waking up from this layer of the dream, so it's the most real thing that you know, simply because it's more consistent and more persistent than your dream world? Right now, you probably have no memory of waking up from here previously and experiencing the certainty that comes with hindsight. When you die, you wake up, and all this becomes apparent. But if you've never had a near-death experience, and you have no memory of anything before your birth, then this waking reality dream is the most real thing you know. It's the most real thing you can remember. And you may be unable to fathom waking up from here into another layer of your own mind. But as far as I can tell, based on my experiences, your mind is infinite and your experience continues. Don't take this on as a belief. If you've never experienced this before and are having a hard time wrapping your head around it, take it on as a question you're trying to answer. Why on earth would someone say what I just said? What kind of experience did I have to end up the way I did? What kind of experience would you need to have to convince you that what I'm saying is true? This is the way. I'm not the only spiritual teacher who feels this way. What do you think it means when you hear a spiritual teacher say, "There is no other"? What do you think they mean by that? It sure sounds like they're talking about solipsism, doesn't it? If all is self, if everything is interconnected, and if other is an illusion, what have these people been trying to communicate? The conclusion is obvious from my perspective, but spiritual teachers are not usually as blunt as I'm being. Most people will not make it far enough to realize these teachings, so why confuse them and try to give them something to wrap their mind around when they don't have the prerequisite experience to be able to do so? A typical spiritual teacher who is awakened and understands what I'm talking about will more than likely give the best advice they can to gradually shift the perspective through exercises and practices. And with a solid practice, people will be more likely to bring about their own experience, which is the real teacher that can teach exponentially more than any guru can. This stuff only seems to get through when it's approached indirectly. When people have these awakening experiences, they'll have to put things together for themselves anyways. There are so many different degrees and types of awakening experiences. If you stumble across any given spiritual teacher, chances are they've had some kind of awakening experience if they're devoting their life to this stuff, but it's unlikely they've had the larger perspective awakenings and made it to the realization that they are God. That's the largest, most encompassing perspective that anyone could possibly have.